Dylan did not give Will time to think, because she knew that thought was the only thing that could destroy what she was trying to do. The confession came not as a moment of shared vulnerability, but as an emotional ambush delivered at speed, wrapped in urgency, fear, and a desperate sense of inevitability. She told him she was pregnant as if the words themselves were a burning fuse, already halfway to detonation, and before Will could even process what the sentence meant, she had already moved to the next demand. They had to leave, immediately, together, without explanation, without preparation, without looking back. The private plane waiting on the tarmac was not just a mode of transport but a symbol of escape, of severed consequence, of a life forcefully rewritten before the previous one had the chance to protest. Will's shock was visible not in words but in stillness, in the way his body lagged behind Dylan's momentum, as if his mind were stuck several seconds behind reality, trying desperately to catch up. He did not say yes in any meaningful sense, but Dylan did not need him to. She interpreted his confusion as permission, his silence as consent, and in the space between one heartbeat and the next, she took control of the narrative, the direction, and the future she intended to impose on him. The speed at which everything unfolded was not accidental. Dylan had planned this moment with the precision of someone who understood that hesitation was her enemy. She knew Will's moral center, his loyalty, his instinct to pause and consider the people he might hurt, and she moved deliberately to short-circuit all of it. She guided him physically, almost gently, but with an underlying force that left no room for negotiation, ushering him toward the aircraft as if the decision had already been made days ago. The roar of the engines, the sterile luxury of the cabin, the closed door sealing them inside all worked together to create an atmosphere of irreversible motion. Will felt as though he had stepped onto a moving walkway without realizing it, carried forward by a force he had not chosen, unable to step off without falling. His thoughts flickered chaotically, images of Elektra surfacing again and again like warning lights he was too overwhelmed to fully interpret. He reached instinctively for his phone, the one remaining anchor to the life he had just been ripped from, only to find Dylan already holding it, her grip firm, her expression unreadable but resolute. The confiscation of the phone was the moment the situation crossed an invisible line, the point at which confusion gave way to something darker. Will felt it immediately, a cold awareness spreading through his chest as he realized that this was no longer about panic or fear alone, but about control. Dylan framed the act as protection, as necessity, as a temporary sacrifice for the sake of something larger. But Will could feel the weight of isolation closing in around him. With one small, decisive action, she had severed his connection to the outside world, cutting him off from Elektra without warning, without explanation, without even the dignity of goodbye. The silence that followed was deafening, louder than any argument could have been. Will stared at the darkened screen, knowing that somewhere not far away, Elektra would soon notice his absence, would begin to ask questions, would feel the first sharp edge of panic, and he was powerless to stop it. The realization settled into him like a stone, heavy and unmoving, as the plane lifted into the air and the ground fell away beneath them. For Dylan, the ascent of the aircraft was both literal and symbolic. As the city shrank below them, she felt a twisted sense of relief, as though distance itself could absolve her of the methods she had used to get here. She told herself that desperation justified urgency, that fear justified deception, that love justified possession. In her mind, the pregnancy was not just a fact but a weapon, a shield, and a prophecy all at once. It was proof that she mattered, that she could not be dismissed, that Will's life was now irrevocably intertwined with hers whether he liked it or not. Yet beneath that certainty lurked a volatile mix of terror and determination. Dylan was not running toward a dream so much as fleeing from an unbearable alternative. Being left behind, being exposed, being forced to confront the possibility that even with a child, she might still lose him. The plane, the isolation, the forced intimacy of shared airspace were her attempt to freeze the world long enough to secure her place in it. Back on the ground, Elektra returned from her work trip with the quiet satisfaction of routine. Expecting nothing more dramatic than exhaustion and reunion, she stepped into her home with the unconscious anticipation of familiarity, the comforting assumption that Will would be there or, at the very least, reachable. The absence hit her not as a dramatic revelation but as a subtle wrongness. An imbalance in the air that made the space feel unfamiliar. At first, she rationalized it, telling herself he must be delayed, distracted, caught up in something trivial. But the longer the silence stretched, the more her unease sharpened into something unmistakably darker. Will was not someone who disappeared without explanation. He was not careless with promises or communication. When her calls went unanswered and her messages remained unread, a cold thread of fear began to weave its way through her thoughts. tightening with each passing minute. The discovery of the private jet was not immediate, but when it came, it struck with the force of confirmation rather than surprise. The pieces aligned with unsettling clarity. The timing of Dylan's last interaction with Will, the abruptness of his disappearance, the telltale signs of hurried departure that felt entirely out of character for him. Elektra did not need proof in the traditional sense. Instinct filled in the gaps with brutal efficiency. Dylan's name surfaced not as a wild accusation but as an unavoidable conclusion, carrying with it a cascade of implications that made Elektra's chest tighten. This was not simply a matter of jealousy or rivalry. This was about agency, about consent, about the terrifying possibility that Will had been swept into something he did not fully understand or choose. The idea that Dylan could have orchestrated this, that she could have leveraged fear and secrecy to isolate him, ignited a controlled fury in Elektra that burned hotter precisely because it was restrained. As Elektra replayed her recent interactions, every overlooked detail took on new significance. Dylan's intensity, her emotional volatility, the subtle undertones of possession that had once seemed merely inconvenient now revealed themselves as warning signs she wished she had taken more seriously. The realization brought with it a sharp edge of guilt, not because Elektra felt responsible for Dylan's actions, but because she had underestimated the lengths to which someone might go when driven by fear and desire in equal measure. The absence of Will was no longer just a personal loss but a violation. A disruption of trust that extended beyond their relationship and into something far more dangerous. Elektra understood, with chilling clarity, that time was now her enemy. Every hour that passed without contact increased the risk, deepened the entanglement, and allowed Dylan's narrative to solidify unchecked. Meanwhile, suspended thousands of feet above the ground, Will grappled with the growing realization that shock had immobilized him at the exact moment he needed clarity most. As the adrenaline faded, the emotional weight of what had happened began to settle in layers, each heavier than the last. He thought of Elektra constantly, imagining her confusion, her fear, the questions she would be asking and the silence that would answer her in return. The guilt was suffocating, not because he had chosen to leave, but because he had failed to stop it. He began to see the situation not as an impulsive escape but as a carefully constructed trap. One that relied on his decency and his reluctance to escalate conflict. The pregnancy complicated everything, introducing a moral gravity that Dylan wielded with frightening effectiveness. Will was caught between empathy and alarm, compassion and autonomy, struggling to reconcile the part of him that wanted to protect others with the growing understanding that he himself was now in need of protection. Dylan sensed the shift in him even without words. She could feel his resistance coalescing beneath the surface, and it terrified her. Her certainty began to fracture, revealing the fragile scaffolding beneath. The very measures she had taken to secure him now threatened to expose her intentions. And she oscillated between justification and dread. She told herself that once they landed, once things slowed down, once he had time to accept the reality of the pregnancy, everything would stabilize. Yet even as she clung to that hope, she knew she had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Control, once seized, demanded constant reinforcement, and she was painfully aware that the more tightly she held on, the more inevitable his eventual rebellion became. Elektra, refusing to succumb to panic, began to methodically reconstruct the timeline, turning emotion into action. Her suspicion of Dylan hardened into resolve, and with it came a clarity that cut through fear like a blade. This was no longer about waiting for answers to arrive, it was about pursuing them. The image of Will isolated, manipulated, and unreachable fueled her determination, transforming helplessness into purpose. She understood that whatever Dylan's motivations, the situation was spiraling toward a confrontation that would not remain private for long. The disappearance, the secrecy, the forced separation were not sustainable, and Elektra prepared herself for the reality that when the truth finally surfaced, it would shatter more than just relationships. As the plane continued its silent arc through the sky, 3 lives moved further out of alignment with each passing mile. Will hovered in a state of suspended agency. Dylan clung to a future built on coercion and fear, and Elektra stood at the edge of action, her instincts sharpened by love and outrage in equal measure. What began as a confession had become an abduction of circumstance, a collision of motives that no amount of distance could contain. The silence between them was not empty but charged, heavy with consequences waiting to be unleashed. Somewhere ahead lay the moment when the momentum would break, when the truths Dylan was trying to outrun would finally catch up, and when Will's absence would no longer be a mystery but a reckoning. And when that moment arrived, none of them would emerge unchanged. The moment the aircraft leveled off and the initial violence of ascent faded into a deceptive calm, the silence inside the cabin became unbearable. It was no longer the stunned quiet of shock. but the heavier, more deliberate stillness that comes when avoidance can no longer hold. Will felt his thoughts finally begin to coalesce. Not into clarity, but into pressure, an internal force that demanded release. He turned toward Dylan not with anger at first, but with something more fragile and dangerous. The need to understand. The distance between them, though measured in only a few feet of polished cabin space, felt immeasurable, stretched thin by betrayal, fear, and the unspoken recognition that whatever had brought them onto this plane had already altered the shape of their lives. Will's voice, when it finally emerged, carried the weight of delayed reaction, each word sharpened by the realization that this was no longer a misunderstanding to be smoothed over but a confrontation that could not be postponed without consequence. He demanded to know the truth about the baby, about the timing, about why he had been given no space to process what such a revelation meant. Beneath the questions lay a deeper accusation, one he struggled to articulate even to himself, that he had been maneuvered, not persuaded, pulled forward by a momentum that was never truly his. Dylan listened without interrupting, her expression taut with a mixture of resolve and fatigue, as though she had been rehearsing this explanation long before he ever asked for it. When she finally spoke, it was not defensively, but with a quiet urgency that suggested she had reached the limits of what secrecy could contain. She admitted that she had tried to hide the pregnancy, not out of malice, but out of fear, out of the desperate belief that if she could just delay the truth, she might find a way to control its impact. Each passing week had been an exercise in containment, a fragile balancing act between denial and inevitability, until her body itself had begun to betray her efforts, signaling that concealment was no longer possible. Dylan explained that the decision to run had not been born in a single impulsive moment, but had grown gradually, fed by anxiety and reinforced by every imagined outcome in which staying meant losing everything. She spoke of how she had convinced herself that exposure would only lead to judgment, rejection, and the slow erosion of any chance at building a family. In her mind, escape had become synonymous with protection, a way to carve out a space where the world's expectations could not reach them, where the child could be born without scrutiny and raised without interference. She framed the plan not as abandonment, but as preservation, insisting that leaving was the only way they could truly be together, the only way to raise their child free from pressure and disapproval. To Dylan, the plane was not a prison but a sanctuary, a vessel carrying them away from a reality she no longer trusted to be merciful. Will listened, torn between empathy and alarm, each emotion colliding violently with the other. He could see the fear beneath Dylan's reasoning, the exhaustion of someone who had been carrying a secret too heavy to sustain. And yet that understanding did nothing to quiet the growing sense of violation coiling in his chest. The issue was not the pregnancy itself, but the way it had been wielded, the way his consent had been assumed rather than sought. He felt anger surface, sharp and undeniable, not because Dylan was afraid, but because her fear had justified, in her mind, the removal of his agency. He questioned the logic of escape, challenging the idea that isolation could replace trust, that distance could solve what honesty might have confronted. With every exchange, it became clearer that they were no longer debating a plan, but two entirely different interpretations of love and responsibility. The conversation exposed the fault lines between them with brutal clarity. Dylan equated togetherness with proximity, with physical closeness enforced if necessary, while Will understood it as a choice that had to be renewed willingly. Even under pressure, he spoke of Electra not as a rival but as a reality that could not simply be erased. Her absence now a wound he felt acutely with every passing minute. The knowledge that his phone remained out of reach intensified his sense of urgency, transforming concern into something closer to panic. He imagined Electra searching for him, piecing together fragments of evidence, her fear growing sharper with each unanswered question. The thought that she might believe he had chosen to disappear, that she might interpret his silence as abandonment, was almost unbearable. Dylan's insistence that cutting contact was necessary struck him not as protective, but as profoundly unfair, a decision that inflicted pain in advance to avoid confrontation later. Dylan, sensing his resistance solidify, doubled down on her justification, clinging to the idea that once they reached their destination, once the chaos of flight gave way to stability, everything would make sense. She spoke of time as a healing force, convinced that distance from immediate conflict would soften Will's objections and allow him to accept what she saw as an unavoidable reality. Yet beneath her certainty ran a current of dread she could not fully suppress. She knew, even as she argued, that trust once broken could not simply be rebuilt by proximity alone. The measures she had taken to secure their future had also exposed the fragility of that future, revealing how much of it depended on Will's willingness to forgive rather than his genuine agreement. While this confrontation unfolded high above the ground, Elektra refused to remain paralyzed by uncertainty. Her initial shock had hardened into focus, and she moved with the clarity of someone who understood that waiting would only allow the situation to deteriorate further. Drawing on instinct as much as logic, she reached out to Finn, and through him, to Steffi, choosing them not merely for their resources but for their ability to act decisively without hesitation. The call was not framed as a plea, but as a calculated appeal for assistance. Grounded in the belief that Will's disappearance was not voluntary, Elektra laid out the facts as she understood them. The abrupt loss of contact, the private plane, the timing of Dylan's movements, and the unmistakable pattern of manipulation that connected them all. Finn listened with growing concern, immediately recognizing the implications of what Elektra was describing. Steffi, equally attuned to the dynamics of control and coercion, grasped the gravity of the situation with alarming speed. To them, this was not merely a relationship crisis but a potential act of containment disguised as protection. Elektra's suspicion of Dylan was not born of jealousy but of logic. And as she articulated her fears, they crystallized into a shared understanding that Will's autonomy might be compromised. The idea that someone could justify isolation under the guise of family struck a nerve, galvanizing their resolve to intervene before the situation escalated beyond retrieval. As Elektra worked with Finn and Steffi to reconstruct Will's last known movements, she felt the full emotional weight of his absence press down on her. Not as despair, but as a fierce determination that refused to yield. Every detail mattered now, every timestamp, every witness, every flight record. Her fear sharpened into something almost surgical, cutting away distraction and leaving behind a singular focus. Bringing Will back, or at the very least, re-establishing contact before Dylan's narrative solidified into permanence. She understood that time was a critical variable, that the longer Will remained isolated, the more difficult it would become to disentangle truth from justification. Back on the plane, the tension between Will and Dylan reached a volatile equilibrium, neither fully escalating nor resolving, suspended in a state of unresolved conflict that mirrored the aircraft's steady forward motion. Will's questions grew fewer but heavier, each one landing with the weight of accumulated doubt. Dylan's answers, though consistent, began to reveal cracks, moments where conviction gave way to defensiveness, where certainty wavered under scrutiny. The pregnancy, once framed as the unassailable core of her argument, now felt to Will like a pivot point around which everything else had been distorted. He wondered, with growing unease, whether Dylan truly believed escape was their only option, or whether it was simply the option that allowed her to maintain control over a future she feared losing. The psychological distance between them expanded even as the physical space remained confined. Each mile traveled deepening the sense that they were moving not toward resolution, but toward an inevitable reckoning. Will began to understand that his silence earlier had not been neutral. It had been interpreted as acquiescence, a misunderstanding that now threatened to redefine his life without his consent. Dylan, for her part, sensed that the foundation she had built was less stable than she had hoped. The weight of her choices pressing down with increasing intensity. She oscillated between the belief that she was saving them both and the creeping awareness that she might have already lost him in a way no distance could repair. As Finn and Steffi mobilized resources, tracing flight paths and exploring legal avenues, Elektra remained at the center of the storm, her emotions tightly controlled but far from muted. She refused to allow anger to override strategy, understanding that clarity was her greatest weapon. Yet beneath that control pulsed a deep, unyielding fear, that by the time she reached Will, the damage would already be done. She feared not just the physical distance, but the psychological toll of isolation, the subtle erosion of confidence that could occur when someone was cut off from their support system and forced to rely solely on the person who controlled their environment. The narrative lines converged in a tension that could no longer be ignored. On the plane, Will grappled with the realization that he would soon have to make a definitive stand. One that would either reclaim his autonomy or entrench him further in a situation he no longer trusted. Dylan faced the dawning truth that control was not the same as security. That the future she envisioned could not be forced into existence without consequence. On the ground, Elektra, supported by Finn and Steffi, prepared to confront a reality that demanded action rather than hope, understanding that love, when tested by secrecy and fear, could either fracture irreparably or emerge sharpened and unbreakable. What began as a concealed pregnancy and a hurried escape had evolved into a complex web of intention and impact, where every choice carried consequences that could not be outrun. The plane continued its journey, cutting through the sky with indifferent precision, but beneath that smooth trajectory lay lives on the brink of collision. Whether Dylan's belief in escape would withstand the scrutiny of truth. Whether Will would reclaim his voice before silence rewrote his story. And whether Elektra's pursuit would arrive in time to alter the outcome all remained uncertain. What was clear, however, was that the moment of reckoning was no longer a distant possibility. It was approaching with every mile traveled, waiting at the intersection of fear, love, and the irrevocable cost of choosing control over trust.